What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka New York Prepper. In this video, I'm going to talk to you guys about how to survive nuclear war, and this is part 3 in the How to Survive a Nuclear War video series. If you haven't seen part 1 and part 2, I highly recommend you go and watch those videos because they give you a basic understanding of nuclear war and some of the critical concepts of nuclear war. So before you watch this video, make sure you watch part 1 and part 2 so you get a basic understanding of some of the critical concepts of nuclear war. And I'll leave a link up above to those 2 videos. And I also have them in my nuclear survival playlist. And all of my nuclear survival videos are in that playlist. And I'll leave a link up above to that playlist as well. And if you guys want to support my channel, you can do so by going to the links in the description box below this video. I have numerous sponsors, and I'm also pleased to announce a new design of my merchandise. And what you're looking at here is my latest design. And it says, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And it's a picture here of my 500 Magnum and me shooting it. And I think "Speak softly and carry a big stick" is a great way to live your life. And I borrowed that from Teddy Roosevelt, who's one of my favorite presidents and happens to be from New York and a big game hunter. But I thought this was a cool design to make. So if you want to support my channel, you can purchase some of my new merchandise and you can get yourself a t-shirt like this. And that's in the description box below this video. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the important components that you need to know of a nuclear blast, a nuclear explosion, some of the critical things that you need to understand. So we're going to talk about the burst altitude, which is very important for a nuclear explosion. We're going to talk about the main components or effects of a nuclear explosion. And then in later videos, I'm going to get into how to protect yourself from a nuclear explosion. But before we can talk about protecting ourselves, we need to have sort of a scientific understanding of nuclear weapons and nuclear war and how nuclear weapons work and the components and the effects of a nuclear explosion. So that's what we're going to continue on in this video. So without further delay, I'm going to turn my attention to the whiteboard and I'm going to share some information with you guys. Now, one of the things you may notice is in all of my videos in this series, I filmed them in my basement. And the reason why is that your basement will be your lifeline in a nuclear war. Your basement will save your life in a nuclear war. It literally is a matter of life and death if you can find a basement or not. You need to have some kind of underground structure that you can go to after a nuclear war so you can protect yourself from fallout and other effects of a nuclear explosion. So if you have a basement in your house, that's really, really good. And I'm going to show you guys in later videos how to fortify your basement to make it into a good fallout shelter. But even if you don't fortify your basement, just going underground into a basement of some kind or underground structure will save your life. Because if you're above ground and you're not inside of a very dense structure, like if you're up inside of your house, in your living room, in a residential stick frame construction house, that construction is not going to protect you from gamma rays. So it's very, very important that you prep your basement for the possibility of having to use it as a fallout shelter. So I'm going to talk about that in later videos, but just keep that in the back of your mind that your basement will save you from nuclear war, from death during nuclear war. It's literally a matter of life and death, okay? Now, in addition to your basement, there's some other important things that we need to discuss. And it's not just the nuclear war itself or the effects of the explosions that you need to worry about. You also need to worry about the aftermath of a nuclear war, okay? So even if you survive the blast, the fallout, and everything else, the radiation, doesn't mean you're going to survive nuclear war, because after a nuclear attack, especially a nuclear war, the world is going to change, okay? You're going to come out of your fallout shelter or out of your basement, and it's going to be a completely different world, okay? There's not going to be any 911. There's not going to be any police. There's not going to be any firefighters. Probably no National Guard. The military may be crippled. There may not be functioning hospitals or medical care facilities. The food supply is going to be tainted temporarily. So surviving the explosions and the effects of the explosions is not enough. You have to also survive the aftermath, okay? So keep that in the back of your mind. And what I always recommend is that people have at least 3 months worth of food stored in their homes, because what's going to happen is a lot of the food supply in the country is going to be tainted with radiation, and the top layer of the soil is going to be contaminated with radiation. So it's going to take a few weeks for the radiation to fully subside after a large-scale nuclear attack from Russia or China, okay? So keep that in mind. You need to have at least 3 months worth of food on hand and at least 30 gallons of water on hand, because the water supplies are going to get tainted as well, especially any kind of above ground water supplies like reservoirs and rivers and streams, things like that. So having some kind of well system is really good, because the well system is usually hundreds of feet below ground, and that'll protect the water from any kind of radiation. So that's something really important to keep in mind. So I'm going to talk to you guys about what actually happens when nuclear weapons are launched, okay? So when a nuclear weapon is launched, we have different ways of detecting when a nuclear weapon is launched. So we have what are known as early warning radars. So some of the ways that we detect when nuclear weapons are launched is with early warning radars or over-the-horizon radars and satellites. Now, early warning radars can detect any kind of plane or submarine or missiles for a distance of up to 3,000 miles away, sometimes even further. So the early warning radars primarily are used to detect incoming bomber planes or any kind of missile that's launched from a sub in the ocean, okay? And I talked about the components of a nuclear triad in part 2 and part 1, so I can't really discuss it in this part. You need to go back and watch that. But the early warning radars are primarily used to detect nuclear weapon launches from submarines and any kind of bomber planes, okay? Satellites can also be used to detect the launch of a nuclear weapon, okay? Now, these two methods of detecting the launch of a nuclear weapon are usually very precise, and they're able to actually calculate the trajectory of that nuclear weapon, okay? So what happens is we have what's known as NORAD, which is North American Aerospace Defense, and it's in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And NORAD is like the brain of all of our radars and satellites and communications. Everything feeds into NORAD. The early warning radars, the satellites, and any other kind of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance information goes into NORAD. NORAD is like the brain, okay? Everything feeds into NORAD, and from NORAD, they can disseminate the information wherever it needs to go, okay? But all of the raw information and raw data gets fed into NORAD, okay? And we have early warning radars on the East Coast and the West Coast and Alaska and also in Canada, okay? We have a treaty with Canada that was created during the Cold War where we're allowed to put radars and even ICBMs in Canada. And the purpose of the treaty is so that we can protect ourselves from any kind of nuclear weapons coming over the Arctic and down over Canada and into the United States. And in return for Canada allowing us to put missiles and radars on their soil, we have a deal with them that we're going to basically protect them and also give them warning if anything's coming, okay? So we have sort of like an alliance or a deal with Canada, and that's why it's called North American Aerospace Defense. It's not just American Aerospace Defense, because we have these radars in Canada as well, and the radars are pointed in different directions. Like I said, they can go up to 3,000 miles. They can detect any kind of plane, submarine, or missile being fired at the United States or North America. And they have these radars on the East Coast. They have one in Cape Cod. They have one in Maine. On the West Coast, they have one in Washington. They have a bunch of them in Alaska. And they also have a bunch in northern Canada, in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, all the way up near the Arctic Circle. They have a bunch of radars there. And those radars are pointed towards the Arctic. In case any kind of missiles come over the Arctic, they can detect those missiles coming. So what happens is, as soon as a missile is detected, either by the radars or the satellites, now the satellites are primarily used to detect the launch of ground-based ICBMs, okay, versus the radars are primarily used to detect bomber planes and submarine launches, okay? Submarine launched ballistic missiles. But both of these can detect the launch almost immediately, okay? And as soon as that launch is detected, the information is fed to NORAD, and NORAD immediately can calculate the trajectory of the weapon, where it's going to go, and how long it's going to take to get there. So as soon as they have that trajectory calculated, they disseminate that information to everybody, including the president, including the military, and also through the EAS, or Emergency Alert System. Okay, now many of you guys that grew up back in the day, they used to do a lot of tests of the Emergency Alert System all the time, usually in the middle of the night. And the Emergency Alert System is basically alerts that you get on your TV or on your cell phone. And what's going to happen is they're going to tell you in the alert specifically where the weapons are headed for, the nuclear warheads. It's going to say exactly where the warheads are expected to land and how long it's going to take to get there, okay? So the emergency alert system in a nuclear war, it's going to tell you where these warheads are going to be landing, so you're going to have a little bit of time to prepare, okay? And generally speaking, for a submarine-launched ballistic missile, you're talking about a 15-minute travel time from the launch until the impact or detonation. And for a ground-based ICBM, you're talking about a 30-minute travel time. So it's not really that much time to prepare, especially if you live close to a nuclear target where you would be subjected to the immediate effects of a nuclear explosion. So if you're in a place like New York City, or you live right next to a critical military base like Minot Air Force Base and many others that I mentioned in part two. In part two, I talked about nuclear targets. So you may want to go back and watch that video if you didn't see it. But if you live right next to a nuclear target, you're going to have between 15 to 30 minutes to find suitable shelter to protect yourself from the immediate effects of the nuclear explosion. And I'm going to talk more about how to protect yourself and what kind of shelters to look for later on. But in this video, we're just going to talk more about how the weapons work and the components of a nuclear explosion and the effects. All right, guys, so it's important to know the different types of detonations when it comes to a nuclear warhead. You have what's known as a subsurface burst, a surface or ground burst, an air burst, or a high altitude burst. Now, the reason why it's important to understand the different types of detonations is that each one of these types of detonations are going to have different effects. So certain types of detonations will have, let's say, a higher amount of fallout than others. Others will have more of a blast wave. So depending on what type of detonation we have, it's going to have a huge effect on how you need to protect yourself and what the actual threats are going to be from the explosion. So a subsurface burst is typically underground or underwater. And a good example of a subsurface burst is a bunker buster bomb. If you guys don't know what a bunker buster bomb is, that's basically a bomb that's designed to penetrate through several feet or several meters of ground or rock or any kind of hardened material like the reinforced concrete of a bunker. And it's designed to penetrate through that hard material and then detonate after it penetrates a certain distance, okay? So that's what's known as a bunker buster, and that's a classic subsurface burst. Another example of a subsurface burst is some type of an underwater nuclear explosion, and a good example of that is the Status 6 Poseidon underwater nuclear warhead, and that's a Russian weapon, and I talked about it in part 1 and part 2 of this series. And that's just an underwater nuclear torpedo, basically. And it has a huge warhead, and it's designed to detonate underwater, okay? Then we have the surface or ground burst. And this is a detonation that occurs at ground level or just above ground level, okay? So the bomb is detonated right at the ground or just above it, okay? The warhead, not the bomb, the warhead. And a classic example of that is basically a lot of different types of nuclear warheads and ICBMs that we have in our arsenal, or Russia or China have in their arsenal. And a nuclear weapon can be designed to detonate pretty much at any altitude. It could detonate at the surface. It can detonate 100 feet above the surface. It can detonate 5 miles above the surface or 500 meters above the surface. It could even detonate at 200 miles above the surface, which is what EMPs are typically detonated at. They're detonated basically in low Earth orbit. So there's usually not specific bombs. Once you get to the surface bursts and the air bursts and the high altitude bursts, you don't have like separate types of weapons for these detonations, okay? It's really just the subsurface bursts that are very specialized weapons. You have the Status 6, which is the underwater nuclear missile operated by Russia or deployed by Russia, and the bunker buster missiles, okay? But other than that, any nuclear missile or ICBM can be set to detonate at basically any altitude that they want, depending on what kind of effects they want to have, okay? So an airburst is detonated at just above ground level to up to 18 miles above ground level, or 30 kilometers, okay? A high altitude burst is greater than 18 miles, and typically a high altitude burst would only be used for an EMP or to take out satellites, okay? So most likely in a nuclear war, you're going to be dealing with, for you as the common citizen, you're going to be dealing with either a surface burst or an air burst, okay? The high altitude burst is mostly going to be targeting satellites that are in space or some kind of space stations or space weapons. Then they would detonate the nuclear warhead in space. And also an EMP, they would detonate very high. So you don't really need to worry too much about high altitude bursts. The only thing you need to know about these is that they are the ones that are used for generating an EMP. And the subsurface bursts, you don't really have to worry about that too much either, because these are going to mostly be targeting some type of bunkers or hardened structures like Mount Weather or Raven Rock or NORAD. NORAD is in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs. Okay, so any kind of underground military bases are going to be hit with these types of bunker busting bombs. Okay, so they can penetrate through the bunker and detonate and destroy the whole bunker and everybody inside, all the VIPs. Okay, so you really don't have to worry a whole lot about subsurface bursts unless you live right next to some type of bunker. If you're literally right next to it, then you may have to deal with localized earthquakes and things like that. But for the most part, surface bursts and air bursts are what you're going to need to worry about. And so why would a country use a surface burst versus an air burst versus a high altitude versus subsurface? Well, like I mentioned, the subsurface, they're going after bunkers or some type of underwater target. The high altitude, they're going after satellites and they're trying to do an EMP. But what's the difference between surface and air burst? Why would a country decide to use a surface burst versus an air burst? So generally speaking, a surface burst is going to have more damage to a specific target. It's going to have more concentrated damage. So if our enemy is trying to take out a specific target and they don't want to just damage a widespread area just for the sake of causing casualties, then they're going to go with a surface burst, because a surface burst is going to concentrate all of the explosive power and all of the effects of the nuclear explosion into a small area, versus an air burst. The effects of the explosion, the explosive power are going to be more widespread and they're going to affect a larger area, but they're not going to be concentrated into one specific area. So for an example, if let's say we have some type of above ground military facility or some type of above ground target, that's when a surface or ground burst would be used. The nuclear warhead would be detonated right at ground level or basically just above it in order to concentrate all of the explosive power on that specific target. So, for example, nuclear silos, nuclear ICBM silos, okay? I talked about that in part 1 and part 2. Silos are where we keep our ICBMs underground. They're literally just tubes that are underground, and they have a hydraulic door that opens up and allows our missiles to fly out. So if our enemy, which would most likely be Russia, if our enemy were to try to attack our missile silos so we can't use our missile silos at them, they would most likely use either subsurface or surface. So this way they could concentrate the explosive power right onto that silo and destroy it and cause a cave-in so the missile can't launch anymore. Another example of a surface burst would be if they wanted to destroy a U.S. city like Manhattan Island, and they wanted to, let's say, destroy downtown Manhattan, which is where the stock market is, and a lot of other important things like the headquarters of the UN and the World Trade Center. If they wanted to really destroy Manhattan or some other type of important city, they would most likely use a surface burst. Now, an airburst would be used if they wanted to cause mass casualties, and an airburst is actually what we used in World War II when we dropped the nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We used an airburst, okay? So the 2 atom bombs that we dropped on Japan were airburst bombs, and they caused more casualties and they caused more physical damage over a wide area rather than concentrating that power into a specific small area. So generally speaking, an airburst is going to have a wider spread effect, and a surface burst is going to have less of a widespread effect. It's going to concentrate that explosive power into a smaller area than the airburst, okay? All right, guys, so now we're going to talk about the effects of a nuclear explosion, and this is critical. You need to know what a nuclear weapon will actually do and what it's capable of, okay? So the 4 main effects, or actually 3 main effects, are overpressure, thermal radiation, and ionizing radiation, okay? Now, EMP is kind of a separate effect, but it's actually part of ionizing radiation, okay? Because ionizing radiation causes an EMP. But for the sake of simplicity, I broke it down into 4 effects, but really there's only 3 effects, and that's your blast wave, your overpressure, your thermal radiation, and your ionizing radiation, but we're going to add EMP as a separate one from ionizing, okay? So blast wave or overpressure, that's 50% of the effects are overpressure, and the pressure wave, if any of you guys have seen any videos of a nuclear explosion, you have your pressure wave, and that's 50% of the explosive power of the bomb goes into the overpressure and the blast wave, and that's what causes the most physical damage. The overpressure wave can travel at a speed of 600 miles an hour, and it can destroy buildings. Even the most reinforced skyscrapers can be completely destroyed by the blast wave. Then you have your thermal radiation, which is basically your heat, okay? So when a nuclear warhead detonates, it generates heat of extreme levels, and actually the temperature right at the detonation point is as hot as the core of the sun. You're talking about millions of degrees Fahrenheit in temperature at the core of the explosion, at the actual flash point, the fireball. The fireball of the nuclear explosion is as hot as the core of the sun, okay? So millions of degrees Fahrenheit. And then you have your ionizing radiation, which is what you think about as your classic radiation and what we really need to protect ourselves from. For most people in the United States, we need to concern ourselves with ionizing radiation because that's what's the biggest threat, more so than the blast wave and the thermal effects, because the blast wave and the thermal effects are only going to really be a concern if you live close to a nuclear target. If you don't live close to a nuclear target, then you don't need to worry about blast waves and thermal radiation so much. But for 90% of Americans, we're going to have to be concerned about ionizing radiation. After a nuclear war, no matter what part of the United States you live in, or North America for that matter, some type of ionizing radiation will get to you. I guarantee you, no matter where you live, if you live in the most isolated high desert in the Southwest, or if you're in the Northwest Territories of Canada, or if you're in Alaska, or wherever you are, some type of ionizing radiation will get to you, okay? And this is where nuclear fallout comes in, okay? Nuclear fallout or fallout radiation is caused by ionizing radiation, okay? It's gamma radiation, and gamma radiation is the worst kind of radiation because it has a very strong penetrative power. It can penetrate through dense materials. So you're going to have your gamma radiation here with the ionizing radiation, and that's a byproduct of the fission and fusion materials inside of the warhead, okay? That's a byproduct of the explosion. And then you have your EMP. Every single nuclear warhead is going to generate an EMP, okay? So most people think of EMPs as a specific type of weapon that's designed only to create an electromagnetic pulse, but actually EMP weapons are basically nuclear warheads, okay, that they detonate up high in low Earth orbit, as I mentioned earlier. But every single nuclear weapon can generate an EMP. So depending on what type of detonation altitude, as I spoke about earlier, the surface burst versus the air burst, that's going to have a big effect on the EMP, okay? Generally speaking, air bursts, the higher up the explosion is, the more of an EMP effect you're going to have. If you have a surface burst or even a subsurface burst, you're not going to have much of an EMP effect, okay? So ionizing radiation has two major components. You have your initial radiation, and then you have your residual radiation, okay? Your initial radiation is 4% of the explosive effects of the nuclear weapon, and then your residual radiation is 10%, okay? And your residual radiation is your fallout, okay? And that's what's going to really affect us the most. 90% of Americans and 90% of people in general in a nuclear war, you're going to have to worry about the nuclear fallout. That's going to be your biggest enemy, is protecting yourself from the nuclear fallout. And that's, again, 10% of the whole nuclear explosion. And your initial radiation is only 4%. Initial radiation is the radiation that's given off as soon as the bomb goes off, as soon as the warhead goes off. That's your initial radiation. It's like an initial pulse of high radiation, and it doesn't stick around for very long. It decays very quickly. Within the first minute of the warhead detonating, you're going to have a very high pulse of ionizing radiation, and it's going to be very, very dangerous to anything close to the flash point. But the good thing about initial radiation is that, like I said, initial radiation will decay very, very quickly. It's not going to linger around like the residual radiation or the fallout. The fallout is going to linger around for several weeks. But the initial radiation is really mostly a threat if you live very close to the detonation point. If you're right next to a nuclear target, if you live in downtown Manhattan, or you live right next to an ICBM base in the Midwest or in Montana, then you're going to have to worry about initial radiation. But that's just a very high pulse of radiation that can give you a lethal dose, okay? If you're exposed to the initial ionizing radiation of a nuclear blast, a nuclear explosion, you're going to get a lethal dose of radiation. You might not die right away, but you will get a lethal dose, meaning that you will die after a few weeks or a few months, and it's not going to be pleasant. You're going to die slowly and painfully, and your body's basically going to be destroyed from the inside out, and it's just not a pleasant way to die. So your initial radiation is just your initial pulse of gamma radiation, and you don't want to be exposed to that. But the good news is it breaks down quickly. It doesn't linger around very long. And if you put yourself a good distance away from the flash point, you don't have to worry about the initial radiation. That's only if you're within a couple of miles of the flash point, then you have to worry about the initial radiation. But if you're more than 5, 10, 20 miles away, you don't have to worry about the initial pulse of radiation. Now, radiation is largely affected by the yield, the explosive yield of the weapon, okay, of the warhead. If the warhead has a larger yield, you're going to have more radiation. So the distance that you have to be away from the flash point is going to be larger. If you have a larger warhead with a more explosive yield, you're going to have to be further away from the flash point so you don't get that initial pulse and that lethal dose of radiation from that initial pulse. Okay, so for a small nuclear warhead, like one that's going to be targeting an ICBM silo, you may only have to be a half a mile away from it, or even a mile, and you'll be fine for the initial pulse of radiation. But if we're talking about 10, 20, 30 megaton warheads, you're going to probably have to be at least 5 or even 10 miles away from the flash point so you don't expose yourself to the initial pulse of radiation. But for most Americans, you're not going to really have to worry about the initial pulse. The biggest thing you're going to have to worry about is the fallout, okay? Fallout is the biggest killer in a nuclear war, okay? Fallout is going to be your #1 enemy. So we have to really protect ourselves from fallout. Now, fallout is when you have a nuclear explosion, the fallout is all the debris that gets sucked into that mushroom cloud. When the warhead detonates, you have that big mushroom cloud that everybody's familiar with, and the debris and everything on the ground gets sucked into that mushroom cloud, and the debris rises up into the sky and into the stratosphere. And once it gets into the stratosphere, that fallout is then carried by the winds, and the winds will blow that fallout downwind, and they'll deposit downwind. The fallout particles will deposit downwind, okay? Now, fallout is largely affected by wind speeds, and also whether you have a surface burst or air burst or subsurface burst or high altitude burst. All those things, wind and the detonation altitude, will have a huge effect on fallout, okay? And that's why I had to show you guys what the different types of detonations are, okay? Most people don't know that. Most people assume that a nuclear weapon just detonates at ground level. It comes down and it hits the ground and it explodes. But you can detonate a nuclear weapon any altitude you want. And depending on the type of explosion, the explosive yield, okay? So if you have a more powerful bomb with a higher explosive yield, you're going to have more fallout. If you have stronger winds, the winds are going to blow the fallout further away. And also if you have a high altitude burst or a surface burst, that's going to have an effect on the fallout. Generally speaking, a surface burst is going to have much more fallout than an air burst. Typically, air bursts don't have much fallout at all, okay? But I'll talk about that more later on in this video. So, fallout is the biggest killer. Like I said, guys, it's just debris that gets sucked into the mushroom cloud, and it gets carried aloft by winds in the stratosphere, and it can be deposited, you know, hundreds of miles away from an explosion. So that's why fallout is so dangerous, because you don't have to live close to a nuclear target. You could live 200 miles away from a nuclear target, and this fallout is going to reach you, okay? But generally speaking, you want to be far away from nuclear targets, because the further away you are from a nuclear target, the fallout is going to take longer to reach you, so you'll have more time to prepare. So that's something to consider as well, okay? But all of these effects, the blast wave, the thermal radiation, the ionizing radiation, and the EMP, all of these get multiplied as you increase the explosive yield of the weapon. So if the explosive yield is higher, you're going to have more blast, more heat, more ionizing radiation, and a stronger EMP, okay? So that's obvious, that's common sense, but I guess many people these days don't have common sense. As they say, common sense is not so common anymore. So the blast wave or overpressure, that's a major concern if you live close to the nuclear target. Blast waves and overpressure are going to be a major concern of yours, okay? If you live in downtown Manhattan, or you live right next to an ICBM base, or you live on an ICBM base, if you're in the military, you're going to have to think about protecting yourself from the blast wave and the overpressure, and also the thermal radiation as well, okay? And then also you're going to have to worry about ionizing radiation and the EMP too, okay? So if you're further away from a nuclear target, you don't have to worry about the blast and you don't have to worry about the thermal radiation. You only have to worry about the ionizing radiation and maybe the EMP, okay? So that is one of the major advantages to living far away from a nuclear target, is that you only have to deal with this, okay, ionizing radiation. You don't have to worry about blast and thermal. Now, if you live close to a nuclear target, the thermal radiation is going to be a major problem. There's going to be an immediate rise in temperature. There's going to be what's known as a thermal pulse, okay? As soon as that weapon is detonated, that warhead is detonated, the temperature is going to rise to hundreds, to thousands, to even millions of degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how close you are to the flashpoint, to the fireball, okay? And like I said, the fireball is going to be millions of degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to be as hot as the core of the sun. And basically, anything that gets touched by the fireball is going to be completely vaporized and incinerated and melted, okay? But the further away you get from the flashpoint, from the fireball, you're going to have less of a thermal effect, okay? But you can still get third-degree burns up to 30, 40, 50 miles away from the detonation point, depending on the explosive yield of the bomb. And I'm going to get more into that in further videos, in later videos in this series. I'm going to talk about how far away you have to be to get away from the third-degree burns, the first-degree burns, the second-degree burns. But a very powerful nuclear warhead can give you third-degree burns as far away as 30 miles, or even more in some cases, okay? So thermal radiation is going to be a big problem, even for areas that are 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 miles away. You still may have some thermal effects, okay? And again, the further away you go from the flashpoint, the thermal effects are going to be less and less, okay? Same thing with the blast wave, the overpressure, that's common sense, okay? So let's talk about the blast wave now. That's the big elephant in the room here. That's where 50% of the energy of the explosion is going to the blast wave, okay? The blast wave is what is going to cause the most physical damage, is the blast wave and the overpressure, okay? Think about a grenade, okay? That's what the blast wave and the overpressure is. It's like if you were to hold a grenade in your hand, pull the pin, and let it go, it would blow your arm apart, right? That's exactly what a nuclear warhead does, but on a much larger level, okay? So the blast wave and the overpressure is going to completely obliterate a huge area. Depending on the explosive yield of the weapon, it'll have an effect of up to 5 miles, 10 miles away from the flashpoint. And there's different zones of destruction, which I'll talk about in the next video. All right, but in this video, I just want you guys to get the basic concepts. You have your blast wave, which is 50% of the energy of the explosion. You have your thermal radiation, which is your heat, that's 35%. Then you have your ionizing radiation, which is your initial pulse of radiation, which decays rapidly, and you can be a pretty close distance and still not get that pulse, okay? If you're within a few miles of the flash point, you won't get that initial radiation. You have to be very close. And then the residual fallout is the biggest killer in a nuclear war, and that's what everybody's going to have to worry about. And then the EMP, okay? So this is critical. You have to understand this. These are your main effects that you have to protect yourself from, okay? Now, going back to the blast wave. The blast wave is going to be a big threat if you live right next to a nuclear target. Blast waves are very destructive. They do physical damage, like I mentioned. They can blow over buildings. Some buildings can be completely destroyed. If you're close to the flash point, even reinforced buildings can be completely destroyed. Okay, if you think about like the sturdiest skyscrapers made of reinforced concrete, they're going to be completely destroyed close to the flash point. Okay, and think about 9/11, the way that the Twin Towers looked after they were hit by those planes and after they collapsed. That's what a lot of the big buildings that are subjected to a nuclear explosion will look like. Okay, they're going to be completely obliterated. And the further out you go from the nuclear explosion, the damage will be less and less. On the extreme end, you'll have, like I said, complete reinforced concrete buildings that are completely leveled and destroyed. And then if you go further out, you may just have, let's say, residential homes that may have their roofs blown off or some walls may collapse. And then if you go further out, you may only have windows that shatter, okay? So depending on how close you are to the flash point, to the nuclear target, you're going to have to deal with different levels of damage, okay, and different threats. If you're 50 miles away from a nuclear target, you probably just have to protect yourself from any kind of windows. You want to get away from any kind of windows. And that's why back in the day they had the duck and cover thing. Okay, the duck and cover was to protect you from the overpressure of the blast. So when the shock wave comes through, the blast wave comes through, when it breaks the windows, you don't want to be near the windows because the shrapnel of the glass can damage you. And also the blast wave can carry debris and objects with it, like beams and pieces of metal and things like that, and it can carry that debris. And if you're standing next to a window, when that blast wave comes through, you could get hit upside the head with a log or a piece of metal, and then on top of that, the glass can cut you. So, and that's if you're really far from the blast, okay? If you're close to the blast, to the actual flash point, then you're going to have to worry about entire buildings falling on top of you, okay? Then you have your thermal pulse, and closest to the flash point, you could see complete incineration, like I mentioned. You could see even steel being melted and liquefied, and that's if you're very close to the flash point. And then further out, you may get less of an effect. You may just have certain things catching on fire. You could get burns. Your shirt can burn to your skin. If you're wearing clothing, the clothing can burn, and your skin can get burned that way. You can also have spontaneous firestorms from flammable materials like fuel tanks and gas lines that are going to catch fire, okay? You can still experience third-degree burns up to 30 miles away, like I said, guys. So thermal radiation is also a big killer, but again, that's for people who live close to a nuclear target, okay? That's why I always recommend people when they buy a house and they settle down into a house, or even when you find an apartment, try to locate yourself away from nuclear targets, because then you only have to worry about the radiation and the EMP. You don't have to worry about the blast and the thermal. And then obviously you have to deal with the after effects after the bomb goes off. and society is in complete collapse mode, obviously you're going to have to deal with that as well. Okay, so, but thermal pulse, on the extreme end, you could see complete incineration and melting of steel. And on the other extreme, you might just get some light burns on your skin. But anywhere within the thermal radiation zone, you could possibly see spontaneous fires being started by this thermal pulse. Okay, so any area that's affected by the thermal pulse, even if you're 40, 50 miles away, you might still have areas that get spontaneous fires from things catching on fire. Okay, so thermal pulse is very dangerous. You could get third-degree burns. A third-degree burn is a burn that goes all the way down to your bone. Okay, third-degree burn is very, very bad. You don't want to get a third-degree burn, especially after a nuclear war. A third-degree burn could be even a death sentence because you could get infections. There's not going to be many doctors around to help you. Our society is going to be in complete collapse mode. So if you get a third-degree burn after a nuclear explosion and there's a nuclear war, you might not even make it, okay? You may die weeks later from infection, you know, because of the deep burn all the way to the bone. And if you don't have a way to treat that, you don't have antibiotics, you don't have a sterile operating room, and people who know what they're doing, then you could die from that, okay? So you want to get away from that zone of third-degree burns, and I'll talk about that in the next video. And then you have your ionizing radiation. And before I get into the ionizing radiation, again, I want to just mention the firestorms. Okay, firestorms are going to be a big danger. Okay, firestorms, like I said, things are going to catch on fire because you have high temperatures. And you're going to have fuel tanks, you're going to have cars with gasoline in them, you're going to have especially natural gas pipes. After the blast wave comes through and knocks down all the buildings, you're going to have gas lines that are exposed, and those gas lines could catch fire. So you're going to have a lot of firestorms with a thermal pulse. Okay, so places close to the explosion, you're going to have to deal with firestorms. Okay. So that's very dangerous. Now, also with the blast wave, I forgot to mention too, that you're going to have to worry about rubble, okay? If you're sheltering in place to protect yourself from the blast wave, you're going to have to worry about buildings collapsing on top of you, okay? So if you live close to a nuclear target, you have to make sure that your shelter is sturdy enough to withstand not only the pressure, the blast wave, okay, but also any kind of buildings that could collapse on top of your shelter, okay? So that's why, for example, a lot of bunkers are built underground, number one, to protect them from the blast and the overpressure. That's why they have those heavy-duty steel doors that are like hundreds of tons in weight. And they have like 1 foot thick steel doors at these military bunkers. That's to protect from the overpressure if they were to get hit with a direct nuclear detonation right on top of them. But also these bunkers are built underground, so they don't have to worry about things falling on top of them. So rubble is going to be a big concern. And with the thermal radiation, you have to think about firestorms. Now, ionizing radiation, if you're close to the flash point, you're going to get a lethal dose of radiation within the first few seconds. But if you've sheltered in a good shelter, you don't have to worry about that. And furthermore, if you're close enough to the flash point where you're going to get exposed to the initial radiation, then chances are you're not going to make it anyway because you're going to be blown apart by the overpressure and you're going to get burned alive by the thermal pulse, okay? Now, fallout is going to take up to 2 weeks to completely decay, and it may take several more weeks for the food supply to be safe enough for the country to continue to use the food that's available from livestock and crops and things like that, because livestock and crops are going to absorb the radiation and the fallout is going to land on them. A lot of livestock will probably die unless the farmers bring their livestock into a barn somewhere, but a lot of livestock will probably die. Some of the crops may die off, but it's going to take up to 2 weeks for the fallout to decay to the point where it's safe enough to go outside of your shelter and walk around like you would normally do before the nuclear war, okay? So that's basically what the effects are of a nuclear explosion: blast wave, thermal radiation, ionizing radiation, and EMP, okay? So now what I want to talk about is I want to talk about how the different types of detonations will affect the blast wave, the thermal radiation, the ionizing radiation, and the EMP. All right, guys, so now we're going to talk about how these nuclear explosion effects change depending on the detonation altitude and the type of detonation. So a surface burst is generally going to produce the most amount of fallout, okay? And the reason why is the warhead is detonated at ground level or just above ground level, and that causes all of the debris in the surrounding area to get sucked into the mushroom cloud and then picked up into the sky and into the stratosphere, where all that debris rains down as fallout, sometimes hundreds of miles downwind from the flashpoint. And fallout generally looks like sand particles, okay? That's what fallout looks like. It's like a brown sand, and that's what it's going to look like when it rains down on your home and in your area. You're going to start to see this brown sandy stuff coming from the sky and landing on everything, okay? That's what fallout looks like. But surface bursts produce the most fallout. Air bursts produce the most overpressure and thermal radiation, and air bursts will produce almost no fallout at all, okay? So actually the best case scenario in a nuclear war is that our enemy is going to use mostly airburst warheads. So this way we don't have to worry about the fallout spreading across the whole country and exposing 300 million Americans to lethal levels of radiation. But the problem is our enemies are not only going to use air bursts, they're going to also use surface bursts. That's unavoidable in a nuclear war, unfortunately, okay? Air bursts would most likely be used to target cities and any place where they need to do widespread damage, like I mentioned earlier. And the reason why an airburst is better for that is because when you detonate the warhead above the ground, like if this is the ground level here, the bottom of this board is the ground. If we detonate a nuke, let's say 50 miles above the ground, what's going to happen is the pressure wave is going to spread out in all directions, and it's going to propagate further than if the bomb is detonated at ground level, because then the ground absorbs some of that shock wave, some of the blast wave or overpressure. Okay, so when you detonate up high, that blast wave can spread out much further because there's nothing absorbing it. Then when you detonate at the ground level, the ground is going to absorb a lot of that explosive power. Okay, now another thing I forgot to mention earlier is that surface bursts will also propagate a blast wave underground, okay? Not as much as a subsurface burst will. A subsurface burst will obviously create the most damage underground because it's designed to penetrate into the ground and explode underground. But even a surface burst, if you're underneath a surface burst, you're still going to get some shock waves that are going to propagate through the earth, okay? So just because you're deep underground, if you're in a bunker, even if you're in a bunker, let's say you're in Mount Weather, or you're in Offutt Air Force Base, or you're in Raven Rock, or you're in Cheyenne Mountain, and Russia detonates a nuke right on the top of you, even though you're in that bunker, okay, you're not going to have to deal with as much effects as a bunker buster or subsurface bomb, okay, but you're still going to get some blast effects, okay, through the ground, okay. The ground is going to shake, and you may even have some cave-ins. If, let's say, you take shelter in a mine, an abandoned mine, and let's say a weapon detonates right on top of the mountain, there will be some blast that gets propagated through the ground, okay, and that could cause the mine to collapse. Or if you're in a bunker, if the bunker has a weak point, or the bunker doesn't have a way of flexing. Typically, most nuclear war bunkers like Cheyenne Mountain or Raven Rock, they have like these giant springs underneath the bunker, underneath the foundation of the bunker. They have huge springs, okay? Imagine if your house, the foundation of your house had huge springs in each corner underneath the foundation, okay? And what that does is when there's a nuclear weapon detonated on top of the bunker, when that shock wave goes through the ground and there's some vibrations, the bunker's not going to collapse. It's going to be able to bounce around and move. It's not going to crack. The walls are not going to crack. The concrete's not going to break, okay? But if you're in a poorly designed shelter, or you're in some kind of a mine, or if you're in a subway tunnel, or you're in a basement of some type of high-rise building, and you're like right underneath the blast, you better be ready to expect some vibration and some cave-ins and stuff like that, okay? So let's say you live in New York City and you get a text message, not a text message, you get an emergency alert on your phone that there's a warhead incoming and you have 30 minutes to prepare, and you go into a subway tunnel, which is a great place to go for surviving a nuclear warhead, okay? You're going to feel some vibrations, even though you're underground, even though you're in the subway. You're going to feel some vibrations. You may have your ceilings cave in on you or collapse near you, so that's something to keep in mind, okay? But generally speaking, a surface burst will have the most fallout. It still is going to produce a lot of overpressure and a lot of thermal radiation, but it's not going to produce it over as much of a wide area as an airburst will. Okay, so airbursts typically are used if they want to maximize civilian casualties, or if they want to damage a widespread area, okay, because that blast wave is going to propagate further because there's no ground to stop it, okay, so all of that energy is going to spread out in all directions, okay, and that's going to do maximum damage. It's going to do the most physical damage. Airburst is going to cause the most physical damage of all of these, okay, so think of it that way, all right. Airburst typically is going to be used in cities, okay? If our enemy wants to destroy cities and they want to maximize civilian casualties, or they want to maximize physical destruction, they want to damage a widespread area, they're going to use an airburst, okay? So that's what you need to be concerned with. If you live near a city, that's what you have to worry about more, is an airburst rather than a surface burst, okay? And again, with an airburst, there won't be any fallout. So if you live near, let's say, New York City, you may not have to worry so much about fallout because they're probably going to do an airburst. If they want to wipe out New York City, unless there's some secret stuff under New York City, there might be, I don't know. I've heard that there's gold underneath some of the banks, like the Federal Reserve in New York has gold underneath, and the World Trade Center used to have gold in the basement. So unless they want to damage that gold, if they want to damage the gold, then they're going to go with a surface burst or subsurface burst, so they can concentrate that explosive power right where that gold is, or where whatever they're trying to destroy at the ground level or at the subsurface level. But airburst is going to be used more likely to damage larger areas, like if they want to damage a whole city, that blast wave is going to propagate much, much further than a surface burst will, okay? and it's going to cause a lot of buildings to collapse. It's going to cause more of a thermal pulse. The thermal pulse is going to spread out further from the flash point, just like the blast wave is going to spread out further. So it's going to damage a wider spread area, but you're not going to have any fallout with this type of an explosion because the explosion is going to be several miles above ground level. Okay, if this is ground level, the explosion is here. There's not going to be any debris that's going to be sucked into the mushroom cloud because the mushroom cloud is going to be way above ground level. Okay, so that's why airbursts, you don't have to worry about fallout. Okay, and then high altitude, you don't really have to worry about that. That's going to cause an EMP. And subsurface, you will get some fallout, some localized fallout with a subsurface burst, okay? But it's not going to be as much fallout as a surface burst. Okay, surface burst will have the most fallout, airburst has the least fallout, and subsurface burst has the second most amount of fallout out of all these, okay? And high altitude, there's no fallout at all right? And the subsurface burst, you're not going to have to worry too much about overpressure or thermal effects or EMP effects unless you're very, very close to the subsurface detonation of the weapon, okay? So if you live like very close to, let's say, you know, some kind of bunker like Cheyenne Mountain or something, some kind of underground facility, if you're like right next to it, then you're going to have to worry about maybe some earthquakes, or if they detonate it underwater, like with the Status 6 Poseidon, it could cause tsunamis and stuff like that. Okay, if they detonate the Warhead underwater, it could cause a tsunami, especially if they detonate it deep in the ocean. Okay, but for the most part, subsurface bursts, we don't really need to worry about them too much unless you live close to some kind of a bunker. And then you're going to have to worry about cave-ins. You're going to have to worry about earthquakes, vibrations caused by the underground explosion. It could cause the ground around the area to cave in and have some landslides and things like that. But for most people, you don't really need to worry about that. And there will be some fallout generated by a subsurface burst as well. So still there will be some fallout here, but not as much fallout as the surface burst, okay? So I hope you learned something here, and now we're going to just go over a timeline, and we're going to talk about what happens from the time that a nuclear warhead is detonated, from the time it's actually detonated until several hours after. I'm going to talk to you guys about what to expect, okay? So stay tuned. All right, guys, now before I go through the timeline of the effects, I want to just quickly mention the optimal burst altitude. That's something I forgot to mention before. So depending on what the target is, our enemies will calculate what's known as the optimal burst altitude, okay? And depending on what kind of damage they want to do, they decide how high to detonate the weapon. Do they detonate it underground? Do they detonate it at surface level? Do they detonate it 5 miles above the surface? Do they detonate it 10 miles above the surface? Okay, and that's all calculated by very smart people, and that's called the optimal burst altitude. But there is also a law of diminishing returns when it comes to using airburst weapon. The higher up you go in altitude, there's a certain point where you reach the maximum amount of effects from the airburst, the overpressure, and the thermal radiation. At some point, if this is the ground level and this is the sky, as you go up in altitude, there's a certain point where the airburst will have its maximum level of overpressure and radiation, thermal radiation. And then as you go up more to the sky, you'll have less and less of those effects, okay? So there is a law of diminishing returns as you go higher. Same thing as you go closer to the ground, you'll have less overpressure and less thermal radiation as you go closer to the ground, and also as you go up higher into the sky. So I want to share this timeline with you guys. So So within milliseconds of the detonation, you can expect an intense flash of light, and that can cause flash blindness, which I'll talk about in the next video in this series. But that's all you need to know for now. Instantaneously, you're going to get that intense flash of light, which can cause flash blindness. You're going to get your initial pulse of radiation, and then also the ground near the detonation is going to be the source of the fallout. That's going to be within milliseconds. All that debris is going to be sucked into the cloud and then rain down as fallout hours later. Okay, so that's within milliseconds. Flash of light, flash blindness, initial pulse of radiation, and also the EMP as well. And then also the fireball is going to expand to its maximum size within milliseconds, okay? And within seconds of the detonation, you're going to have a thermal pulse, which is going to cause burns and fires up to 30, 40, 50 miles away from the detonation point, depending on how strong the bomb is, okay? So that's within seconds, you're going to have that thermal pulse to deal with, okay? So you're not going to have much time. If you know that there's a bomb coming and it's going to land in 30 minutes, once that bomb lands, you better be in your shelter, because you're not going to have much time to get away from the thermal effects. And then also the blast wave. The blast wave, which is, again, 50% of the energy of the explosion goes to the blast wave, and you're only going to have several seconds to get away from that blast wave. And the blast wave can rupture your internal organs. It can cause your lungs to collapse. It can cause your eardrums to explode. Okay, so blast wave and thermal pulse are going to be within seconds. Within milliseconds, you're going to have the flash. You're going to have the fireball reaching its maximum size. You're going to have the debris getting sucked into the mushroom cloud and up into the sky to rain down as fallout. And then you're going to have your initial radiation pulse. And within minutes, you're going to have your fallout cloud that's going to rise. So all that debris is going to rise up into the sky, and it's actually going to start raining down and reaching the ground within 10 minutes. Okay, so the closer you are to the detonation point, you're going to have to start to deal with the fallout in as little as 10 minutes. Okay, if you're only a few miles away from the explosion, then you're going to have to start to deal with the fallout. Okay, now within hours, you're going to have to worry about hazardous level of fallout being deposited downwind. Okay, it could be up to 5 hours, 10 hours, 15 hours, depending on how far away you are, depending on how strong the winds are. Okay, and then you're also going to have structure fires, like I mentioned earlier, firestorms. Within a few miles of ground zero, you're going to have structure fires. And within a few hours, actually, some of the radiation is already going to start to decay within a couple of hours, okay? And I'm going to talk about that later on, but within a few hours, you're going to have a decrease in the radiation by a factor of 10, okay? So that's something to think about too. And then within days, you're going to have low levels of fallout spreading globally around the world over a period of several days to weeks, all right? So the fallout will spread globally within days, okay? It's going to take several days for the fallout to spread around the world. If we're talking about hundreds or thousands of nuclear warheads being detonated around the world, it's going to take several days for the fallout to spread globally. But you don't really need to worry too much about that, because by the time the fallout spreads, it's going to already basically be decayed, because it's going to be in the atmosphere for so long. So we don't really need to worry about global fallout. That's more of a science fiction movie type thing. But also within days, you could possibly experience hot spots, okay? And hot spots are caused by weather, okay? The fallout or the radiation can be sucked into a cloud and then the cloud can rain, and the rain will deposit the radiation. The rain could actually be radioactive. Okay, the rain could be radioactive, and they call that rain out. And it could even happen with snow. Okay, any kind of precipitation could cause localized hotspots of radiation. And that actually happened in the 1950s when they did a nuclear test in Nevada. There was a rainout in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York, literally on the opposite side of the country. There was a hot spot of radiation, 2,000-3,000 miles away. Okay, but also within days, you're going to start to see the radioactive fallout reduce in its intensity. Okay, so the fallout is going to start to decay after a couple of days. It's going to start to be a little bit more safe. You're still going to have to take a lot of precautions when you go outside, and you want to really limit your exposure. When you go outside, you want to limit your exposure to the radiation outside of your shelter, even after a couple of days. But after a few days, the radiation will start to decay quite a bit to the point where you can actually go outside of your shelter for very limited periods of time and not have to worry about absorbing a lethal dose. So that's pretty much it for part 3. I hope this video was useful for you. And I'm going to be uploading part 4, part 5, part 6. There'll probably be several more parts to this series. So stay tuned to my channel for more nuclear war survival videos and a continuation of this series. Thank you guys for your support. And as always, take care, God bless, and don't forget the 3 Ps. Prepare, practice, and persevere.